help facilitate the conversation. And that is in the Green Task Force. It's a task force of City Council, head up by Councilman Benson. There's a subcommittee on master plan sustainability and resiliency. And that group has been putting in place ideas for how to move the city's soon to be launched master planning initiative. They have 3 simple goals. Sustainability and resiliency are elevated and incorporated into the master plan. That a comprehensive master plan of policies is updated, it's of high quality and useful for all. And that the mayor's office has a top level official who's championing sustainability and resiliency. You might say, well, what's that got to do with environmental justice? Bottom line is our whole city, given the demographics, given the amount of contaminated land, the levels of poor air quality that persist, most everyone here is negatively impacted around their health, and their health is compromised on a regular basis. So we're believing that a systemic approach where we look at the large opportunities to make wholesale changes is the way to go, that you can't just go one steel mill at a time or one highway at a time. You've got to have a bigger vision and try to be accountable to that vision.
Kathryn, coming back to you, do you feel like that vision is taking place at the city planning level, that there is that cohesion starting to form? And I want to come back to this. You talked about the blank slate and how this isn't a blank slate. I mean, part of the challenge is that we're shaping these ideas around existing structures, existing communities, people who are living here. But is that cohesion starting to take shape?
It's difficult for me to answer that question because of the newness of the administration and the planning director. They're the ones that are really tasked with that. Mm-hmm. But to kind of piggyback on what folks have been saying, I think we have to look at both a integrated open space plan, which sounds really big and kind of far removed to some people, yeah, and hard to grasp when you start talking about master plan. But at least if we don't know what that is yet, if we don't know what the integrated open space plan is, to plan open space in an integrated way. So we have a lot of activities that are already going on, and I'll talk about agriculture. There are pockets of the city where there is a lot of concentration in agriculture. So how do we plan that in an integrated way? We see how we can protect those gardens that exist and see how we can build out from that. So maybe we have part of Todd's trails that are involved in that. Maybe we add stormwater to that. Maybe we add trees for the carbon, looking at the trailways. So we build out from some of what we already have and then figure out ways to connect it. That's one way I think that we might be able to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, bringing that community piece back in, and the other conversations we've had in this series, we've always had this question about how best to engage the community in this process. How do you pull people in, help them to feel that they are a legitimate part of this process? And give us some language around that.
So to make it simple, I would say consistency. Talk consistently to residents. Talk early. Find out what people want and what people need early, and work from there, not the other way around. Residents, I think, are very savvy. They know how they got to where we are now, and they know where they'd like to be. And they're not sort of tied down by what does the master plan say, or what foundation is giving money for what. They just know the end game of where they want to be. And I think it's for us to figure out all that stuff in between to make it happen.
So really, there are 2 tracks occurring though. So you have the city planning level work that's being done, and that has to be done. You have that larger infrastructure piece that's trying to coexist with the community piece. So how do those two pieces work together? And anyone's open to answer that question.
I don't know that they always do work together, to be honest with you. I think projects that Land Inc. does are a little bit probably bigger than sort of neighborhood-based projects. And I think Dan mentioned earlier pilot projects. We do a lot of pilot projects. And it's really all we can responsibly do without a bigger comprehensive plan and a very serious commitment to an innovative open space network. All we can do is test ideas and see what works and how people feel about it, how it looks, does it do what's intended. So I'm not sure that it always does work, but I think, you know, in Detroit we keep trying, right? We do it ourselves and see what happens a lot of times.
Kathryn, you have any thoughts?
I think we have to strike the balance of where the city leads and where the city follows. Because a lot of times I say that the city has to catch up with the community. Because people in the community are willing to take risk and to do without having the resources. A lot of times they are able to get things done without some of the things that the city has to take into consideration to get things done. And that's not to say one way is better or another. Because there are a lot of legal and a lot of other considerations that the city has to have as it's moving forward, but certainly the city needs to involve the community as early in any planning process or redevelopment process, and make sure that there is an authentic effort to have city voices, citizens' voices heard and reflected in plans that move forward.
Guy?
Earlier, Mr. Cox, our new planning director, was mentioned, and I've heard him speak a couple times, and he's bringing to the table the idea of having big visions. And I'm not sure how much he's caught up with the big visions that have already been articulated. To kind of echo what Kathryn was saying, there's a lot that's been done that the city can follow, and I would hope they would do so. One example is not just doing the Beltline network, but the entire Eastside Network that has about 12 segments to it. That were we to complete that and link it to the other segments that have been over several years done across the city, then you've got recreation, you've got amenities. I don't know that the city's tuned into the economic impact that Greenway networks are having all over the country and other places.
Talk a little bit about that economic impact.
Well, when you have the connectivity of neighborhoods, it tends to stabilize, and people bring investment in homes near those trails. Businesses pop up, small businesses that feed on the traffic. I think actually Todd probably is the better one to speak to it in detail, but I just think when we propose a project like an Eastside Network, there's too much focus on the expense and not enough recognition of the upside benefit of having the whole thing in place as opposed to having fragments in place.
Todd, would you like to build on that?
Sure. I think one of the issues that we run into in the city is that working with a certain department is that they have their own silo, and you need them to do something for you to build a greenway, but the benefit is actually to another silo in the city. So, you know, for example, if you're trying to improve streets to reduce car crashes for the public works department, that doesn't affect them at all. It costs them in their budget, but it saves the police department money. So, I mean, for us, we have to make sure we get all those things together and break down those silos, and so that helps us build these bigger networks, because public works isn't really so concerned about economic development and bringing in more taxes, because they get road taxes or you know, fuel tax. So it's tough to make that sell. But we have, and in terms of, it's still kind of early to see the economic development of trails, although we're seeing a lot along, of course, along the riverfront and the DeQuinter Cut with new housing infill going in. I mean, as soon as the DeQuinter Cut extension began construction, you know, developers bought up the buildings along the edges of that. So we expect those to be developed. So it becomes a great tool. Trails can become a great tool to foster economic development in areas that could really use it.
I want to talk a little bit about the language. And Kathryn, this is something you alluded to when you first started to speak. Do you think we're starting to see a paradigm shift in the way we talk about this space? We know that from, and as a member of the media, I will totally let this be on me, but it was more of an external to internal process talking about Detroit and the vacant land and the blight and it wasn't talked about as an opportunity. You would see different, film crews come through and it looked like, it had been bombed out. It looked like no one lived in Detroit. And I'm wondering if at least internally, we're starting to see a shift in both paradigm and in the language that people are using around this open space. Are you starting to sense a sea change at all? Mm-hmm. Kathryn?
From a city government perspective,
Yeah.
yes, I think that in city government, we have always pushed back on what the media has pushed forward. And the blight and all of those things. It's a constant pushback, and it becomes very frustrating of who decides what that narrative is and who characterizes the city and who characterizes who's doing the work in the city. But that's something that has got to be effort on the city's part as well as the community's part to tell the story that we want to tell and to uncover the gems that we want to be uncovered. We cannot rely on the media to do that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have thoughts about that? As you're working out in the community or engaging with your other partners, are you starting to feel a shift, perhaps more optimism in the way open space in Detroit is viewed?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I was actually at the River Days event, and I was sitting there talking about greenways in the city, and this longtime Detroiter said, "Detroit's never going to build any greenways." And I said, "You're standing on the Riverwalk. That's a greenway." So, but I don't hear that as much anymore. And I know before the DeQuinter Cut was built, a lot of folks said, "Well, I'm not going to go down in that ditch. It's not going to be safe." And now people are saying, "When is it going to be extended? When is it going to be longer?" So we've seen a lot of change around, because now that we have examples we can point to, and they say, "Oh, I know what that's like now. I want that in my neighborhood."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that actually leads us to our first audience question. This comes from Kenneth, who says, "In my neighborhood, we have alleyways that aren't used for anything anymore. Is it possible to use this type of land for bike trails or community gardens? And what would be the process since the city owns a portion of the alley along with the residents?" And that might be a Kathryn question first, and then we can come to you, Todd, about whether or not you're seeing some examples of how people are using those alleys.
That's an interesting question about the alley, and it depends on if it's open or if it's closed, and there's a process of getting it closed so that the people on either side are able to use it, and then it would be much easier to convert it into a community garden. I'm not sure how that works with trails. Todd, you'd probably be able to answer that a little better, but there would be a process that you could turn that space into productive space. But I would caution anyone that wanted to turn an alley into a productive space because of its former use and all of the cars and oil and gasoline and all of that kind of thing. So we have to be cognizant when we're talking about productive uses, that we're talking about productive uses in a city where there may have been uses historically that mean that we need to do some things before we start growing food.
And how does that happen? And this is a question, I'll come to you, Todd, about the use of trails. But we are talking about, in some areas, industrial land that was used for industrial purposes, or it could have just been, like you said, a place where people park the cars. What is the process for making that a safe place to plant or to use in that kind of function?
Well, some places just aren't safe places to plant. And so that's why it's a good idea to work with us in the city, to work with some of the organizations that work with growers, like Keep Growing Detroit and the Greening of Detroit, because they can help you with who to talk to in the city, how to make those decisions, how to get land tested, and those kind of things, because all properties are not appropriate for growing food.
Do you have any thoughts about that, Guy?
I'm not sure I have much to add to it. I mean, there's, depending on the size of the property and the prior use, there are different strategies for how to investigate it. And obviously the expense tends to travel with the size of the property.
And Todd, the person also asked
Jennifer,
about, oh yeah, sure.
One thing I want to add, and a lot of people make this mistake with a lot of different uses, is that they will purchase property before they find out some of these things, before they look at zoning, and then they come to the city, they've spent all this money and they want to do something and they find out they can't do it, and then they're mad, usually at the city. So make sure before you purchase a piece of property for whatever use it is, that you come to the city first and have all of those questions answered.
Thanks for adding that. Todd, what about this idea of using those alleys as thoroughfares, perhaps for walking trails or bikes?
Well, we have some examples in Midtown where they're being used as primarily pedestrian, the green alleyway and then the new alleyway by Jolly Pumpkin to Avalon. I think there's some limited applications where that makes sense, but it's a challenge in the neighborhoods because they cross in the middle of the road, and so if you're riding your bike, it's not going to be safe to cross the road at that point. Typically, cars aren't going to be expecting you. I think as part of the city's lighting program, they're no longer supporting lighting in the alleyways. It's a question about who's doing the maintenance in the alleyways. There's not many eyes on the alleyways, so I know a lot of folks don't feel safe. And then, of course, in the winter, they typically aren't plowed. So there's a lot of issues, but I wouldn't rule them out as a possibility in certain circumstances.
Jackie, I'm going to throw this next question to you. It says, how do you preserve open space that is desired by neighborhood? Let me rephrase. How do you preserve open space that is desired by the neighborhood from development efforts that would negatively impact the area? Are there community efforts that can take place to maybe block some of the development that they don't want to see there?
Wow, who asked that question?
They didn't give me a name.
I can't answer that. Sure, I think an organized community who has legitimate concerns about a development, I think, can be heard and can certainly get a response from the city or a developer or whomever. On the other hand, if no one says anything, then it won't stop. Sure.
Are there organizations or any resources you can direct people to and say this may be a good place for you to start if you're concerned about this happening in your neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with your block club, your neighborhood association, and from there, your community development organizations like Eastside Community Network in the Leap area, and there's a handful of them around the city.
Guy.
Well, I think we're really talking about the primary topic of tonight, which is the need for a plan. I mean, the whole purpose of the array of land use tools like a master plan and zoning and so forth, is to try to keep together the vision of the community in a way that's organized and around what people would support. So one of the reasons it's so important for us to move forward and update these plans is so that we can realign what's expected to come into the space with what people do want. So like now is the time to be expressing what you want proactively rather than just kind of hanging back and seeing what shows up and try to stop it.
And I would just add too that I think the opportunity for the sort of neighborhood scale level of preserving open space for a block or a couple of blocks, that opportunity is probably better now. I think the process for side lot acquisition is somewhat smoother and a little more transparent than it's been in the past. So,
This next question starts, preface with my excitement and optimism. So consider the question prefaced with excitement. They say open space does not generate taxes. So what types of programs are in place to take care of maintenance and to ensure viability of any given space, especially one that has gone through this development process? And Kathryn, do we have the maintenance structure in place to support this development?
I don't know. There is so much, and that's part of the challenge. There's so much open space, and only so much that the city can do. And I think the city is probably partnered with other entities, and certainly partnering with people in the neighborhood. It's going to take more than just the city to help with maintaining all these spaces in neighborhoods.
Well, that very neatly leads us into our next question. What is the private sector's role in the use of open space? How do we encourage for-profit, sustainable, and equitable open space development? So is this a place for the private sector perhaps to step in? Yes.
So I want to grab that one and kind of go back to the last one a little bit. So Todd works on recreation and public health, and Guy talks about environmental justice and equity, and Kathryn's here to talk about urban ag and legislative policy. My job is really to figure out how open space makes money and brings investment. So to say that open space doesn't generate tax revenue isn't necessarily true. The hope is that it does. Residents, largely when they talk about what they want, jobs are it. And I think jobs means investment. So I tend to look at open space in those teal areas that we saw on the slides as industrial, if you want to call it that, light industrial development, like green industrial development. So is that green open space actually a business? Is it generating revenue? Is it creating jobs? Is it making tax revenue? And the maintenance kind of follows with that. So that's sort of the piece of the open space network that I work on. So hopefully it does solve those problems. But without the plan that we talked about earlier, and without the commitment that open land will stay open land for land-based businesses that will create jobs and generate tax revenue, I don't know if it will happen. I can imagine that it will, and I hope that it will, but that's the idea.
Yes, Guy.
Yeah, I just want to mention too that I mean that's a big issue for us, is figuring out how to maintain some of the trails that we're developing and nudging the city along to maintain them better. But I just want to point out too that there's a lot of health benefits to what we're doing, especially with respect to greenways. You know, we have 45. It's estimated at $4.6 million per person. It's just tremendous impact. If you think about the healthiness of Detroiters, the obesity rate, cardiovascular, and diabetes, and the cost of those illnesses in Detroit are tremendous. In that by building greenways and getting more people active, we can address some of those and save a tremendous amount of money. There was a survey or a study done out of the Netherlands which showed that because they bike so much more often than they had in the past, that on average people in the Netherlands live half a year longer. And it contributes 5% to the GDP, which is significant. I mean, starting from where we are from a health basis, we could improve so much and save so much money that I think we can justify getting some health dollars plugged into the maintenance side.
I'd also like to add that I think that there's opportunities for agriculture. Most people, when they think about agriculture in Detroit, and it's because of what most of what people are doing is growing food. They think just growing food. But if we're going to have greenways, and if we're going to have rain gardens, and if we're going to have stormwater, and a lot of these other things are going to require plantings. And so why not, as we develop the rain gardens, the bioremediation, the trails, the beautification, that we have Detroiters growing the plants that will need to be provided for the green infrastructure and the greenways. So I think that there is an economic development potential there as we continue along that path.
We've been talking a lot about Detroit, but we haven't talked much about the regional impact of this development. How does this play into Detroit's place within this region as we're thinking about how to treat this open space? And I think I want to come to you first, Jackie.
I honestly don't know that we've thought too much about it regionally. I don't think we have the city plan yet. And it definitely needs to be thought about, particularly when we start to talk about water, connecting these sort of green and blue infrastructure projects to each other, but to the bigger system it's really important. I mean, we can try projects, but we really don't know if we're making a difference or even if we're doing the right thing in the right spot. So I don't know that we have done that engagement and thought about that.
Anyone else have thoughts about that?
We are certainly thinking about that with regards to agriculture, not necessarily just with open space, but where can Detroit place itself within agriculture in Southeast Michigan? There are a lot of farmers that take their product outside of the state to get it processed. We have buildings that we can repurpose, and we can do processing in the city. We have a distribution network already in the city. We can start to deal with food waste and other type of waste and composting and providing those kind of things. So we are starting to think about agriculture not just as what can happen in the city, but how it will tie to the region.
Just in these final few moments that we have, and I'd like to hear from each of you. Someone asked, how do we balance the need for planning with the urgency that we feel to act? And Todd, I'll start with you.
Well, I don't know if many people went to the 880 Cities conference that was in Detroit, and Gil Panelists had a great comment that, you know, it should be ready, aim, fire, and too often we do ready, aim, 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 and we never pull the trigger and get stuff done. So I think, fortunately, with the work that we've been doing with our coalition and our coalition members, it's taken a long time to get some things to happen, but now they're starting to happen, and every year there's something coming in the pipeline, and people can see it, and they get excited, and they say, what's next? And so it keeps building the excitement. So so we're really excited that we're actually getting some stuff on the ground. We have nearly, when we started, we had about 13 miles of walking and biking trails, and we're going to break 200 miles this year. So we're actually getting caught up to some of the other cities that had a head start on us throughout the United States, and look forward to leapfrogging them.
Guy, when we're talking about the environmental impact, and you talked about the impact on people's health, there is urgency there. So how do you balance that out against the need to plan?
Well, when it comes to open space, I think the most direct possibility around improving health links to the food supply, because the nutrition is something that can take effect right away. The growing seasons are annual, and there's been a lot of planning already done. I mean, earlier I mentioned the Greenway network. There's been by far, I would say, commensurate planning in the ag community around things that could be done, and they're a big scale, but they need a focused allocation of resources to really make those things happen.
Kathryn, urgency versus planning.
Well, and I think I spoke a little to that earlier, is that, you know, what the challenge is to balance that sweet spot between where the city needs to lead and where the city can follow and facilitate. I think that as planners, we cannot be planners behind a desk. We have to be out in the community. We have to come to the meetings. We have to know what's going on so that we can keep on the pulse of what's going on and see where we can facilitate and guide.
Jackie, you get the last word.
So I think my colleagues said it pretty well. I think communities have the ability to plan pretty well on their own. And I think there's a lot of really great projects already happening. There's a lot of learning that's already happening and continues to happen. If we can sort of all collaborate and take all of those lessons learned and just keep moving and keep making things happen, and the city keeps taking note and developers keep taking note, then I think you'll see that we're already creating this open space network. The plan will come. It will come eventually.
Jackie, Kathryn, Guy, Todd, thank you so much for your thoughts and your insights. And we just want to remind you, as you're thinking about what we've talked about this evening, if you have new ideas that you want to share, don't forget to tweet them out, DFC Ideas, hashtag DFC Ideas, or you can also use that hashtag on Facebook. And we want to give you an opportunity to connect with one another. We know there are lots of people here who have their own projects. Use the reception as an opportunity to find out what you're doing and figure out if there are connections you can make. Also a chance for you to connect with our panelists. And we also have those 2 tours that you can take advantage of to Earthwork Farms or Beaufait Beltline Greenway. And Dara, will there be someone out there sort of organizing the tours? The tours will be leaving in about 5 minutes if you want to join one of the tours. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. Have a great evening.